Just this week, the Prime Minister set out what he wanted to see happening.
We're having really detailed discussions with Barclays, with the other major clearing banks, to try and get a settlement of this whole issue. And let me tell you what I want. I want the bonus pools to be lower. I want the taxes that the banks pay to be higher. And vitally, I want the lending that they do to business, particularly small business in our economy, to increase.
Since Christmas, ministers have been involved in discussions with Project Merlin, a consortium of the UK's leading retail banks, trying to strike a deal on pay and increase lending to business. But these talks are only with the British institutions. Why can't the government tell the banks it has big chunks of, Lloyds and RBS, to pay its staff less? Such a policy would be a disaster, according to Professor Chris Roebuck, who's worked as a senior executive in investment banking.
The thing that people do not understand is that probably 70 to 80% of the bonuses that are going to be paid to people in foreign banks who don't have British shareholders, who aren't headquartered in this country, who never took any money from the British government, and who not in any way, shape or form would wish to lend money to the British public. As far as those banks are concerned, and that's probably 21 out of 25, they see no point as to why they should alter their behaviour. The effect of that means that those banks, 21 of them, will set a price for what each job gets paid in the city. That leaves the 4 British banks, and the 4 British banks won't be able to alter that price because the other 21 banks will have set it. That means that if the 4 British banks don't meet the market price set by the foreign banks in London, their best people will literally walk out the front door, walk 50 yards across the road and get paid 20% more.
The rewards can be huge. Today, the American bank Goldman Sachs announced a pay and bonus pot that'll mean 6,000 staff in London will get an average of over £250,000 each. And the high flyers say they can earn even more if they go overseas because of lower taxes and less political pressure. It could mean corporate finance director Kate swapping her meetings at the Royal Exchange in the city for a far better paid job in her native America.
In New York, you make 3 to 10 times your salary in bonus. So in London, it's a bit more conservative here. The stock exchange in London is one of the 4 biggest stock exchanges in the world. Billions and billions and billions of pounds every single month come into London because of the stock exchange. This is a big business for the UK economy. It's important that we continue to attract the most talented individuals. And we don't want a brain drain. We don't want the whole city of London, the brightest minds do get paid the most, to go to New York or go to Europe because they're going to make more money. We can't allow that to happen.
That's exactly what the banker's cheerleader-in-chief, London Mayor Boris Johnson, warned last year. These rewards, coupled with the one-off bonus tax and the increase in the top rate of income tax, could drive 9,000 bankers overseas. But is there any evidence that it's happening?
This is Matt. Matt's our top biller of the month, but he's also managed to win himself the trophy for most valuable player.
Is that it? They just get a cup?
They get the cup of the month. They also get a bigger check.
The rewards at the recruitment firm Selby Jennings aren't quite up to banker standards. The firm has been conducting research into the rates of pay for senior banking staff in Britain compared to one of the supposed favoured destinations for bankers, Switzerland. Matthew Chapman, head of business development, explains what they found.
Once we started looking at the numbers of opportunities available and the salaries that tended to be paid in the 2 locations, and then factored in the tax, the difference became a lot smaller than most of the headlines tended to suggest. So, for example, the salary levels at the senior end in London are simply much higher. That once the tax is factored in, the take-home at the end is up to double what you could get from a similar position in Switzerland. There are far fewer positions in Switzerland to do the kind of work that we're talking about. Not at the senior end only, but even at the more junior levels. There are just smaller organisations, smaller offices, fewer opportunities, and therefore it's much more likely the salary is going to be lower and the take-home at the end of the day after tax is therefore significantly lower at times.
In fact, last year the number of British bankers applying for work permits in Switzerland actually fell by 7%. But what about the other big financial centres in the US and Asia? Research by the accountants PricewaterhouseCoopers found that for bankers earning £250,000, there was little difference between the tax rates in the UK and the US. There are much lower taxes in Asia, but recruitment firms we spoke to said far from being a flood of people leaving, it was barely a trickle. This woman, who we'll call Sarah, who's worked in human resources and investment banking for the last 10 years, says it's not all about the money. She's prevented from speaking to journalists, so we've altered her voice so she can't be identified.
Investment banking is a mobile industry, and some areas of investment banking are more mobile than others. I haven't personally seen as much mobility as we did anticipate and we did feel was coming. A lot of the big hitters already had themselves set up so that they could be tax efficient anyway. We know this. Generally, people in investment banking are very driven, very intelligent people who want to earn their money as quickly as possible so they can go back and have a life at some point. But performance isn't driven just by money, and anybody who thinks that it is misunderstanding the dynamic of performance.
If bankers aren't leaving, what about the banks themselves? It's a more potent threat to London and the tax revenues it receives from the sector. Angela Knight from the British Bankers Association says it's not imminent, but if bank regulations here are tougher than elsewhere, it could happen.
Do we want that business of financing the world operating out of the UK, employing people locally, paying tax locally to continue? Or are we happy to see it decline, in which case we can keep up this way of looking at things and so we see those jobs and that business move? And it's not just a question of a dozen people. We're talking about a large number. And it's not just a question of them. It's all the jobs that hang on the back.
Banks like Barclays and HSBC already have significant bases overseas, and even the Royal Bank of Scotland has its own trading floor just outside New York. But the sheer size of these major institutions means they need a big economy to prop them up should they fail. That means their choices are pretty limited, and Will Hutton from the Work Foundation disputes the suggestion that they'll up sticks and leave Britain.
I think it's balderdash for a major bank that's too big to fail. It ain't going anywhere. It's got to go to a G7 country. That's its choices, because no other economy in the world is big enough to underwrite it if things go wrong. So your choices, if you're HSBC or Barclays, are to locate in one G7 country. And, you ain't going to go to Moscow, you're certainly going to go to Beijing, and you're not going to go to anywhere as small as Dubai, Hong Kong or Singapore, because they simply haven't got a balance sheet big enough to support you if things go wrong, and you know how wrong they could go. So if you're HSBC, your choices are to headquarter yourself in France or Germany. You're going to do that? Of course not. Are you going to go to Tokyo? Of course not. You're going to go to Canada? Of course not. You're going to go to Milan or Rome? No chance. You might go to New York. But do the Americans want you? The Americans have already made it clear that they've got enough banks that are too big to fail. This is complete and total blackmail. The idea that you can walk away from all that and go to somewhere which is much smaller that couldn't do that because you want to pay yourself 30, 40, 50 million pounds without any intervention from the British government. I mean, it is an outrage that the words should leave their lips. An outrage.
Bankers may be getting less of their bonus in cash, but they won't be any worse off. We've learned from bankers and recruitment firms how banks are dealing with these bonus changes. This investment banker, who's worked on trading floors for over 20 years, told me what his organisation's been doing. He didn't want us to use his name, as it could jeopardise his job.
I have had a pay rise. At my level in the banking sector, salaries have gone up over the last year or so. Because bonuses have become regarded as almost evil, perhaps, then salaries have risen. So, along with a lot of other people, I have had a salary rise.
What kind of percentage salary rise did you have then?
I had about a 50% salary rise.
And then what do you expect in terms of your bonus as a percentage that you'll get? I
expect it will be reduced by the rise that I've had and then adjusted for my performance over the last year. I think I've had a good year. My performance over the last year was similar to the performance of the previous year, so I would hope to get the total compensation to be about the same.
So in 1 year, he'll be getting a pay rise most of us would take a decade to achieve. This isn't just the case at one investment bank. Recruitment firms told us salary increases of up to 50% weren't surprising. Sarah, who works in human resources and investment banking, told us at her firm they were much greater than this.
Salaries in a number of organisations were adjusted to balance off the volatility that was concerning the external regulators and the FSA particularly. So In anticipation of bonuses reducing in the future, a lot of salaries were increased, and substantially. Some organisations did 100% increases, some organisations did 50%, 60% of already decent salaries.
And what were you looking at in your bank?
We only looked at salaries where the 60% was the increase to be concerned about. Any increase of up to 60% we were quite comfortable with.
What kind of salary range was that going to affect the most then?
Interestingly, not the lower paid individuals, so that sort of 30, 40, 50,000 pounds a year didn't really see much of an increase. 80,000 pounds to about 200,000 pounds a year saw substantial salary increases, so it was not unusual to see someone going from 80 to 120 in 1 year. It's now perfectly standard to see middle management, senior middle management, but not board level, sitting at £250,000 a year. And this will be the first year that we see whether or not there is any impact on the level of bonuses, or whether actually all we've done is increase the amount of money that's being paid.
Do you want to see the gambling floor?
Back in one of London's financial hubs in the hedge fund haven of Mayfair, Karen Jones, editor of City Wealth magazine, takes me on a whistle-stop tour of Aspinall's, the private members' gambling club and haunt of city financiers. I'm curious about the New York room then. Downstairs on the clubby plush sofas of the main bar, Karen told me about the confidence she's seeing among the seriously rich bankers.
For me, I think it's green light, and it's going to be very positive for luxury sales. I can see diamonds on Valentine's Day. I can see some very happy girls. It's the Ferrari season. The USA have had their bonuses in January and December, and the money's back in the system, spending. I see the same thing going to be replicated here.
Is there already, a sense of people gearing up for that?
Having seen the big brand banks and been in to see the HR directors, everyone's excited. It feels like the money's going to flow into the system.
Bankers are fed up with being the punch bag for the public and politicians. The Barclays boss Bob Diamond told MPs last week the time for remorse is over. Sarah, who's worked in investment banking for over a decade, agrees it's time to stop beating them up.
I think the banking industry is getting a bit tired of it. If you look at some of the organisations where out of 37 product lines, 35 remain profitable through the process. So we're not talking about the majority of bankers who had a role in this. It was 2 product lines potentially. It is not just investment banking who got us in this pickle. Yet investment banking is the only group that's being penalised for it. It's getting a bit dull.
In the next few weeks, we'll find out just how much the big British banks are awarding themselves in bonuses. And whatever the figures, they're likely to provoke an angry reaction. But with even senior bankers questioning the validity of some of the huge bonuses for a sector getting a £100 billion annual subsidy, the hostility from both public and politicians won't go away anytime soon. And there could be far worse news on the way for banks in Britain. In September, the Independent Commission on Banking will present its findings to the government. Its recommendations could see major structural reforms to banks, which will affect far more than just how much they pay themselves.